Lit Fest 2020 or tag at the Jaipur Lit Fest. We love to have more social media. Just make sure that you take your belongings with you when you leave the venue. Excited to introduce our first speakers of the day. The session is called Transformations, the Business of Business. We have Tarun Khanna, Arun Maira, and David McWilliams in conversation with Hindol Sengupta. The session is presented by Business Standard. Hindol Sengupta is an award-winning historian and the author of 9 books. He's a World Economic Forum, young global leader, and has been a senior journalist with the Indian edition of Fortune magazine, Bloomberg, TV India, CNBC, and CNN. He is the only Indian to have won the Wilbur Award given by the Religion Communicators Council of America, and to be shortlisted for the Hayek Prize given by the Manhattan Institute in memory of the Nobel laureate economist F.A. Hayek. In India, he has won the Valley of Words Award and the PSF Prize. Please welcome to the stage our distinguished guests.
Wherever you guys want. I guess I'll take this. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming early in the morning to our session. I was just telling my co-panelists that I would encourage them to say controversial things so that at least the video goes viral and many more people will see us on YouTube, even if they don't see us at this beautiful venue. It's a lovely morning in Jaipur. Thank you very much for being with us. A very, very distinguished panel, ladies and gentlemen. I can't think of, better people in a sense to talk about the topic today than the people on the panel. Some of them I've known for a while. Arun Maira, distinguished career in the corporate world, and of course then at the Planning Commission. Tarun Khanna, again, one of the most foremost academics in business around the world, and also an entrepreneur. If you spot a chai point, he's the man behind it, so grab a tea. David McWilliams, who very funnily told us that he's never had a job, at least for the last 10, 15 years. More, David?
Absolutely.
And yet he's managed to, in an entrepreneurial sort of way, clearly build a wonderful name for himself. Somebody who really understands the topic of today, the business of business and its transformations. I want to begin with a question which I want to put to all 3 of the panelists. And that question is, even about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a certain euphoria about the free markets, about their democratizing impact, which today's people, or many people at least, seem far more skeptical about. How do we address this? What can business do to change itself? And some of these things are already happening, whether it's closing the gender pay gap, whether it's addressing climate change. But what can business do better? And we'll begin with Tarun Khanna.
Thank you, Hindol, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. It's in economics textbooks, when a bunch of us studied variations of economic reasoning, it's common parlance to say that public goods have to be provided by the state. And by public goods, people generally mean things like clean water, roads, infrastructure, things of that nature, basic education. The question that I find myself increasingly asking in 2 very different circumstances. One, the circumstances of my country and home of origin, which is New Delhi, Punjab, where the state is, relatively speaking, somewhat dysfunctional, unable to provide the public goods to the extent that the citizenry and most right-thinking people would imagine it should be provided. What is the role of entrepreneurs and the private sector? Is the role to sit back and adapt to the absence of public goods? or is it the role of the private sector to engage, and I'm choosing my words carefully, to engage in the provision or the partial private provision of public goods? So when I say engage, I don't mean that individual companies should go out there and start providing basic education and so on, but I do mean that I think it is both, I would maintain, in their narrow self-interest to catalyze the state out of its somnolent state, to trigger it, maybe by conversation, agitation. We think of lobbying as being negative. It need not be negative. It could be constructive. But somehow become more actively engaged in the conversation with the state to help it along. Because after all, who is the state in a democratic polity? The state is us. We are the state, ultimately. But also in other circumstances, in my adopted home in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a very high-tech bubble, so to speak, equally, as technology outpaces the ability of the state to stay abreast of developments, in my backyard, one of the things that I'm engaged with in my guise as an entrepreneur is the cost of genome sequencing. The cost of genome sequencing is falling precipitously, which means that we can understand what makes essentially every living creature tick in a way that was infeasible even 5 years ago. And that just is an unlocking of understanding of nature's bounty to an unfathomable extent. It will make the mobile revolution seem puny in comparison in the next 10 years. Now, why am I saying this? The ability of the state to keep abreast of that escalating explosion in know-how is deeply in question. So again, you have the same situation where the people on the front lines of the scientific and technological revolution, I believe, have a responsibility, as well as it's in their self-interest to engage with the state to make sure that the rules and norms that govern their everyday existence are salubrious, constructive, what have you. And when that doesn't happen, you see that with fake news and Facebook and so on and so forth, you have rampant dysfunction. So I would say, regardless of whether it's my hometown of Punjab or my adopted home of Cambridge, the principles are the same, that I would maintain that we need to have much more engagement of private sector with the public good provision, falling short of actually providing the public goods, than we've had in recent times.
That's a wonderful point to segue from. Arun, I want to ask you, this is a very important point, and it echoes in a sense things we have heard and still hear about data, right? Well, look at countries like India and China. They have so much data. It's a huge wealth. It can be used in various ways, right? But today, we also have simultaneously a dramatic misuse of data. Look at what some of the biggest companies of the world have done. Look at how they've influenced elections. Look at the fear of what fake news can do. And today, you have technology that can morph entire identity and faces, and and millions of people can see videos which might seem to be from a political leader or a personality, which are absolutely untrue. And what that does to societies, we really don't know. We cannot even begin to fathom. We're only beginning to grapple with those. And now when we come to a point where we are talking even at a deeper layer, as Tarun is, you have data at a genome level. And you can actually, and I'm going to use this word with some caution, manipulate it. And manipulate could be for the good also, right? But it can be manipulated. What new concerns does this open up, and how can we address it as people who believe in democracies?
Well, thank you very much, Hindol. You introduced the session and us by saying that what we are discussing today, you recall, is like a deja vu that we have discussed before in your book 10 years ago. And before that, 20 years ago, the World Economic Forum, Davos, they presented the research, the data around the world that citizens are losing trust in business. This was 20 years ago, and Klaus Schwab said, wake up, guys, you've got to think differently. And again, 20 years later, this time, they're still saying the same thing. Ideas don't seem to change amongst some people. And I want to then introduce two characters here to say what I want to say. One is Karl Marx and the other is Greta Thunberg. Okay? And I will come to them by taking off from the point that you have made about there's a big revolution of data and technology, and we all try to grapple with the possibilities. They could be good. They are turning out to be, in many ways, not so good. We have to grapple with it. The other is the environment. We're all becoming very conscious that we can't ignore it. Bad things can happen, and our signs are coming up that we've been ignoring it in our thinking too long. Now, the two real forces. One is capitalism and its principles of governance, and the other is democracy and its principles of governance. Capitalism is based on those who own the most have the greatest right in what should be done. And even when democracies were introduced in terms of allowing people to vote for assemblies in the UK, and it's gone on since, those who had property were allowed to be participants in the discussion. And thereafter, those who pay taxes means you have the money, therefore you can participate in the discussions of how the society is governed. So the capitalist model of governance is based on the principle that $1 equals one vote. If you have $1 million, it's your right to have 1 million votes in the decisions, explicitly or implicitly. The democratic principle says that if you have a beating heart, you have a right to say how the society around you should be governed. A beating heart. It doesn't matter whether you own something or don't own something. And we've been progressively learning how to apply this principle deeper and deeper. First, yes, men got the vote, whether they were rich or poor. Then, women also have beating hearts. They should also have the vote. Then we said LGBT, we don't know their sex even, but they have a beating heart. They should also have the vote. Now, it's one heart equals one vote and $1 equals one vote. The principles of corporate governance, the institution of business are entirely on the shareholders have a right because they own how the corporation should function. Democracy says it doesn't matter whether you put the money or not, we have a right in determining how you shall function. Okay, so this is the tension in the world today. So coming to Karl Marx, he said, and so true, that the ruling ideas in any place at any time are the ideas of the ruling class. Link it to our property. Greta Thunberg has been loudly, a young woman, making the point that we are ignoring the climate and the system around us. And Steve Mnuchin, yesterday, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, says, well, she better grow up and go to college and learn economics first before she makes any comments on how the world should be run. And the problem is economics, the idea of economics, which are based for the last 30, 40 years very strongly on the views of the other Friedman, that is Milton Friedman. Business must be only business. You concentrate on making more money for your shareholders, and then the world will be all right, which is based on a wrong principle in economics that human beings are self-interested. That's the nature of a human being, it says. And somehow, if everybody acting on their self-interest was acting on their self-interest, some invisible hand is going to make the environment all right and society all right. It will not happen because the decision rights are not being placed with the people. It's not right. So we've got to change who we listen to, who we pay respect to, and honoring the voices of Greta Thunberg and others who fortunately have not had the wrong education. And as Karl Marx said, well, those are the ruling ideas, and they've caused the problem. So let's not keep listening to the people who caused the problem, whether in Davos or somewhere else, and say, you have the solution. They cannot. I mean, it's inside. How can they have it? Because they've been so used to a certain way of thinking that they can't get out of it. So we need to hear other voices and open our minds to them.
That's a wonderful point. I want to ask you, David, and before we came in, you were saying that you would talk about the entrepreneur, as an individual, in a sense. But so much of the problem begins from that individual, right? I mean, and Arun was...
Don't start with the problems.
But Arun was, have made a very important point that all of this edifice starts with the idea that the individual is selfish. right?
Yeah.
But we haven't been able to tackle that problem to begin with. Are we beginning to recognize it as a problem?
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm going to try and accommodate and change my Dublin accent so it's comprehensible to you. So this is my effort, sounding like the Queen of England. I was told to speak very slowly and with purpose. And if I get overexcited, you can slow me down and force me out of my local patois and back into the English language. It's very interesting there. We were talking about Karl Marx and Tom Friedman and Milton Friedman, and I actually want to talk about James Joyce in the context of this discussion. And the reason I want to talk about James Joyce in the context of this discussion is because when James Joyce was supposed to be writing The Portrait of the Artist, his first book, he goes to Trieste in Italy, and, well, it was in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at the time, and his father, and this is all about the individual, his father, Stanislaus Joyce, is sending money from Dublin to his delinquent son, James, who's claiming to his mother that he's writing a book, which is basically the perennial Irish story of every Irish son, away from home. And Stanislaus sends over the sister, Eva Joyce, the young sister, to find James to see what the hell is the lad doing, because there's no book. And she goes to Trieste and she can't find James for about 8 hours because James is spending all his waking time in the cinema. The cinema is the technology du jour. 1910, right? Joyce is obsessed by the technology. The cinema at the time is the internet. It's the YouTube, right? And Joyce is a big kid and he's online. But he's going to the cinema all the time and obviously he's spending the father's money in the cinema and he's not writing the bloody book that he's supposed to be writing to keep his mother happy and everybody else happy, right? Because most books written by Irish men are written actually to keep our mothers happy, by the way, just so you know, right? So Eva meets James that night and says, "Jesus, Jimmy, where have you been?" He said, "Man, I've been in the cinema all day." She goes, "What are you watching?" He says, "Anything at all. There's 7 cinemas in this town, Trieste." She goes, 7 cinemas? That's extraordinary. Do you know there's not even one cinema in Dublin? Joyce says, "What? Not one cinema in Dublin. Has a population of 400,000. I know in India that seems kind of trivial, but for us that's a lot of people, right? And she says, and even still, there's not even a cinema in Belfast or Cork, our 3 big cities, which are about the size of a suburb of Jaipur put together. And Joyce stops everything, is transfixed by this, and says, "Okay, I'm going to set up the first cinema ever in Ireland." So he goes, he's got no money, of course, because he's living off his father's stipend, okay? And he finds the 4 biggest, what will be now tech investors in Trieste, the 4 biggest cinema owners, who would now be the Silicon Valleys, you know, those Perkins and all those fellas, the private equity dudes, right? Joyce finds these lads and says, "Gentlemen, I have a prospect for you. There is a country which is on the tangents of civilization, called Ireland, up there beyond England, right? And we have 3 major cities and there isn't one cinema. The people are crying out for cinemas. I'll go and I will be the entrepreneur that will go and set up the cinema. The only problem is I have no money." And they say, "Okay, well, we give you equity." So Joyce negotiates all through 12% of the equity to go to Dublin to set up a cinema. And 8 months later, Joyce has negotiated the property, the cinema, the machinery, the marketing, the insurance, the whole shebang, the publicity, and he opens the very first cinema in Dublin, called the Volta Cinema, because anything that sounds vaguely Italian is sophisticated the more north of Italy you go. It's a general rule, okay? Now, the reason I'm telling you the story about Joyce is, A, we're at a literature festival, so we've got to talk a wee bit about writing. But the second thing is because James Joyce, the man who wrote Ulysses, who took the English language, which was bequeathed to us as it was to you, rather forcibly, okay, and decided to change the English language, change the novel, use his extraordinary creativity to write something beautiful, okay? That mind is exactly the same mind as the fellow who said, I want to own my own cinema. Now, what is the connection? The connection, I believe, as somebody who hasn't had a job properly for about 25 years, I did that investment banking malarkey. And actually, once I got one of those young global leaders thing like you, once I got that, I left. I said, Jesus. I said, if I'm getting accolades, I better go and get my own job and do my own thing. Right. But my point is the following. It's very, very critical. The type of brain that produces great artistic work and the type of brain that wants to produce great entrepreneurial work are exactly the same. Because these are the people who don't want a boss. They don't want a wage. They don't want anybody telling them what to do. They want to create something beautiful that is theirs. They want to tell the world, I exist. They want to tell the world, this is me. I have something to say. Whether it's somebody selling coffee in a small coffee shop or a chai shop, somebody writing a great novel, some great artist, the human impulse inside of us is the same. It is the impulse to exist. And that runs incredibly deep in us. And as a consequence of that, acting... Oh, thank you. Jeez, give me more of those. This is my Bono moment. Fantastic. No, but I make the point seriously. That the setting up a company is an act of great courage. It takes real balls to go out on your own. It's an act of great creativity. It's an act, I believe it's a self-expression act that you exist. And I speak as somebody who's written books as well and set up companies. Believe me, setting up a company is far, far harder than writing any bestseller. I can tell you that for nothing. So therefore, what I'm coming back to the point is societies must dignify the types of people who take large risks. And that is not to say you dignify hedge fund guys, right? I'm saying small individuals who do small things, because it is the aggregation of all those small little decisions, those small little acts of courage that create a vibrant economy and ultimately economic growth, the thing that my profession, economists, all go mad about. Economic growth is only a gift which we use or abuse at our peril, but it is a gift bequeathed to us in part, not in total, but in part, by these extraordinary creative people. So to come back to your idea of whether they are a problem, I do not see the likes of Joyce or anyone who does a creative act as a problem. What I see is a fictitious argument against them, which is driven by tin pot ideology, suggesting that they are the source of all evil, when I think they are the source of all creativeness. And all we've got to do is offer them dignity, leave them be, they will do their thing. And the state's role, I believe, is therefore to take the surplus that those creatures produce in the great Schumpeterian world of economics, where we're all bobbing around in this sea of creative destruction, failing, succeeding, failing better, succeeding, etc. Then a surplus is generated, and that surplus should be spent wisely by the state in order to get more little Joyces and more little, I don't know, Zuckerbergs, or whatever you want to call it, to take a chance and go for it. That's the role of, and it's exactly as Tarun says, and Arun, they're all interconnected. Everything's connected. But give them dignity.
Okay. How wonderful. I realized once again, as many of my fellow Bengalis realized in the 19th century, how the Irish and the Bengalis have so much in common. Because like David, ladies and gentlemen, I have a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader to my name too. And I went to Oxford. I wrote a book wrote books to make my parents happy. I went to Oxford to make my mum happy. I now have a government job. Next comes retirement. So it's a wonderful world. Thank you, David, for reaffirming my life choices.
It's your mother's life choices, not yours.
For a Bengali, they're the only choices that matter. Tarun wants to say something.
No, I found myself agreeing with David mostly. My day job, I do have a day job. It's as an academic. I teach, I do research, I write esoteric papers that nobody reads. It's excellent. But my second day job is I start companies. I've started 15. And I agree with you. They are extremely challenging and nerve-wracking and what have you. And the curious thing, I once had a conversation way back when Google was a young company with one of the two guys who started Google. And he said, if I were not an entrepreneur, the next interesting thing I would have liked to be is an academic. Because it's all about the act of creativity, whether it's writing a book, writing a mathematics paper, starting a company. I see it as all very, very similar. So I couldn't agree more. I have one point of, it's not quite disagreement, but qualification perhaps to suggest. There's a philosopher at the University of Chicago, Martha Nussbaum, whose work has influenced me a great deal. And really what her work is about is saying that, look, the act of engaging in the free market, the act of being an entrepreneur, the act of making decisions is an act of individual agency. It requires you to make the choice. It requires young James in Dublin to say, I wish to conjure up a movie theater in Dublin. But what about the people who have no capacity to make the choice? Perhaps because they're starving, perhaps because they are held back in some fashion. And that's certainly the situation in this part of the world for many people. So I think there is that big qualifier. And I say big because I don't know if the 7 billion people, it probably applies to at least 3. That the ability to participate in the market economy is simply not there for practical reasons. And I think it's a moral conundrum for the rest of us to do something about it.
No, I think you're absolutely right, because when I go to poorer countries than Ireland, which when I was young, we were a very poor country as well. What always strikes me is and this is what I find kind of annoying about the Yanks, the way they go on about the entrepreneur, is that there's no shortage of buying and selling amongst poor people. There is no shortage. You go out on the street here, when I go to get a tuk-tuk back to the hotel, the free market is in your face. And everyone's undercutting and cutting, and the piece of property they have is the tuk-tuk. This is a very valuable piece of property. Might be shared, might be leased, I don't know how it works. So the notion that it's a lack of entrepreneurial spirit that makes countries poor is total nonsense. It's something else which we might talk about. It's something else. Maybe it's property rights, maybe it's stability, maybe it's institutional stability. What I always find in Ireland and in Europe, when I'm talking to people who are unfortunate and are poor, what really strikes me about them is their time horizons are very different to mine. So wealthy people can think in the future, can make a plan, can say, I will go to university, I will go and get this, I will postpone making money today because I have some basis for postponement. What I notice about poor people in my own city when I'm talking to them is the anxiety of poverty. It's the immediacy of poverty. It's the idea that you need money not in 5 years' time when you're a bloody doctor. You need it right now. And if you need money right now, you don't have a future. Poverty obliterates the future because your time horizons go from a year or 5 years in our case right down to 5 hours. And that is something that if we could analyze, how do you create stability for people lower down the food chain so that they can believe in the future and not have to worry about today?
Thank you. May I, please?
Yes.
You asking the question again. The people at the bottom of the food chain, they must feel that they have a say, that they have dignity. We're not being told by these experts about what's good for us and giving us charitably their money as well as their ideas. We feel helping them stay where they are not helping us. So we come to, yes, I exist, but I exist because we exist. So the concern in caring for others around yourself, without whom you could not exist, is an ethical problem. And I say that any philosophy or the business idiom which says that look after yourself, everybody, be an entrepreneur and make most for yourself, and the world will be all right. It's unethical. No religion and no secular system of justice would condone people who say, I'm just looking after myself and to heck with the rest. Okay, just give me a moment. So the we, how do we create the we? I come to economics since we mentioned it. 84 Nobel Prizes have been given for economics. Only 2 have been given to women. The first was to Elena Ostrom for a work on the commons, how communities govern themselves to share common resources for the benefit of all and sustain those resources because everybody will and their children will need them. So those principles of governance, which are lateral consideration, not by vote. The present principle, which is, as you say in democracy, that every person has one vote and then you count up. And those who are in the majority, by a certain view, they overrule the rest. But that's not looking at the system. The minority also are part of the system. If they disappear, the birds disappear, the species are disappear, we all disappear. So you've got to listen to many voices and come to decisions there. So she was the first Nobel laureate, a woman. The second Nobel laureate woman was Esther Duflo this year. And her work is also on the ground, things at the ground for poor people, their education, their resources, and so on. So there are 2 views, if I might say. There's a man's view, an alpha male view on I become big and must be noticed, and by me becoming big, the world will be better. There's a woman's view, a mother's view, that unless the family is healthy, none of the children or me or father is going to be healthy. So that orientation, it's an ethical orientation towards others and not about myself. So I talk when we are friends, entrepreneurship, and you put it well. In the business world, entrepreneurship is make more money, get a greater valuation, if you will. In the social entrepreneurship world, and I work with lots of them, that's not what drives them. What drives them is the concern about the health of the whole community. Amitabh Kant, CEO of Niti, just walked in, and that work on the ground with aspirational districts, it's about people working together, being enabled to work together to improve their conditions. Then there's no poverty and there's dignity. That is a world in which there'll be markets for these people who want to sell things to them. So it's an orientation of how you govern, starting with it's about them and it's not about me.
Don't you think, Arun,
I want to quickly intervene and make one quick question, and then maybe all the panelists can take it, and especially since Amitabh is here, who's doing such wonderful work in the Aspirational Districts program. Ladies and gentlemen, since both of us have mentioned aspirational districts, it might be worthy to just mention in a sentence what these are. These are essentially, it's a program that focuses on uplifting and very dedicated and sharp policies to really pick up and reinvent the districts that need maximum help in our country in a holistic way, whether it's water, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's sanitation, and so on and so forth. So that's really interesting. I have always wondered, and I want to put this to you, when we talk about, for instance, AI, and I've just written in Fortune where I continue to write, we always think about the application of AI even today from the top, right? How about, why do we never think, and this is Arun, it's a question to you too, why do we not think, for instance, this is a question I recently asked in Fortune, of marrying our knowledge of AI, of the kind of data that Tarun is talking about, with a program like the Aspirational District? Bring them together, right? Bring our prowesses together so that our technological advancement helps the people who perhaps need it the most. That's number one. And how do we do that? What is the path to getting that? That's a really interesting question which we might want to consider. Second, it has always occurred to, in my earlier avatar as a journalist, I always used to think, this entire thing about startups and entrepreneurship and so on and so forth, how is it that we never think of Indian agriculture or the rural economy as a great bubbling site for entrepreneurship? We always think about startups in Bangalore and this, that, and the other. How is it that, to use an Indian word, an Indian context, how is it that we never think of startups for Bharat? To me, at least in my sort of work, some of the most exciting startups today are people who are doing work in rural India, including one who I met again this time, this camel milk startup called Aayog Foods out of Jaipur, which I absolutely love, run by these two guys. They are the ones who are really bringing together the Indian Prime Minister's vision of doubling farmer income. So how do we reinvent this conversation on startups that it reaches in the Indian context, Bharat, but in the global context, a far more democratized demographic, so to speak? So if all of you could comment on this.
I mean, I have no disagreement with what you just said about the focus on Bharat. I mean, look, there are two enabling conditions, right, to catalyze the James-like creativity in rural Rajasthan, right? One is a little bit more risk capital, or the role of the state in underwriting risk to some extent, so that it becomes like an implicit subsidy to other capital providers, because otherwise they're not going to make a buck and they're not going to channel money towards it. And that's why they haven't so far. And the second is minimal education and training and worldview and stuff like that. Both those are addressable problems. And, the work in the aspirational districts and so on is one example of somebody trying to do something about that. I'm sure there are dozens of other experiments that we could collectively trigger, and we should. But that's really the thing that's holding it back. Again, I don't think there's a conflict between the point of view of the entrepreneur as the source of creativity and the fact that you need a collective ethos in some sense. I don't see a conflict. It's maybe a bit of an artificial conflict to some extent. It's a question of emphasis. We do have a segment of society that's demonizing the entrepreneur today, right? And we have a segment of society that's bemoaning the lack of ethics, and there's some truth to both of those.
I think I want to come in data. Peter Drucker, management guru, I think the wisest management consultant guru of the last century for a while will be. He used to say this, and he used to consult with presidents of companies and of countries also, that I never, ever, when I first meet a person and discuss a problem, ask them for the data. I ask them for their opinion, because every smart person is capable of finding the data to support their opinion. And this is becoming endemic in the world of social media. You can get any information to support your opinion. So the opinion is primary. The idea is primary. The ideology is primary. So if we wish to really understand someone else, don't ask them for the data, just ask them what they believe in. And this comes to myself. I am always instinctively choosing data to support my opinion. I think I'm being objective, but I'm very subjective in finding the data, and research is troubled by this. Because the papers give you a lot of data and a lot of equations, and I'm a physicist and I know. First you go to add the hypothesis. Then you look for an experiment and the data to support that hypothesis. Economics is missing this. The papers are full of just numbers, and you say, I can see the ideologies. With the same source of information, a person will prove to be, in your mind or my mind, a communist, and a person will appear to be very capitalist. They're looking at the same information. Why is it? Because they've chosen selectively what suits their opinion. So I come down to data analysis. Please stop using data first. First, just inquire with the situation, inquire with the people what matters. And a very wise person in India, Dr. Abe Bang, said this, and he's done great work in public health in Gadicholi, the tribal areas. He said the problem with our academics, our experts, is that they are using people as the data to prove to others, like themselves, that we are smarter academics than you are. So people are data in their theories, rather than saying, if I've got a way to think, and I've learned how to think and been taught how to research and think, what is your question? What is your need? And let me apply my tools to solve your question. And what I produce there may be of no interest to other academics. And Dr. Abe Bang answered this to us when I was with the National Innovation Council, when we said, how come the world's best experience, as Lancet says, in improving public health with very little resource, it's mostly community resource, is not known and talked about? He said because precisely this, that this is of no interest to the academic journals and the juror journals. They are talking about how to improve public health through their solutions. So I come to one thing, must say, that the SDGs are about global issues, poverty, inequality, water, pollution, and so on. These forces, including data, which are causing these universal problems, get together in different places in different forms. The problem of environment and livelihoods in Rajasthan is quite different to the problem of livelihoods in Kerala or up in the mountains. The solutions have to be local, systemic solutions, but local. So the solutions to these global systemic problems have to be local system solutions produced by the many stakeholders, listening to each other and figuring out that we all are causing some parts of this problem, what can we do differently? So I come back to Lena Ostrom's work and also Abhijit's work now. We've got to orient ourselves quite differently before we use data. Because we can, as Facebook is saying, you can use data very badly, evilly.
It strikes me that if we're talking about data and its mismanagement or management, maybe, and we're talking a wee bit about economics too, we should be aware of what J.M. Keynes, the great John Maynard Keynes, said about economics. He said, it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. So think about what he's saying there, okay? It's better to have a good sense of where we are going than to have a precise sense of something you believe in which is totally wrong, proved by your equations and your models, etc. So it's always struck me, as somebody who started as a central banker many years ago in the cauldron of economics of a small country, that economics and what we're talking about here, we're talking here about something much greater. We're talking about philosophy. We're talking about history. We're talking about anthropology. We're talking about where we came from. We're talking about family. These are extraordinarily important units that have been with us for many, many millennia. And what economists fail to understand maybe is another thing that Keynes was very, very bright about. And sometimes when I'm teaching the kids in college, I try to say to them, look, maybe the most important thing in economics is a thing that is called the paradox of aggregation, which of course only economists could come up with something as mangled as the paradox of aggregation. The idea is what is good for the individual is not always good for the community. So you can see that in any particular issue, and this is to get back to your point, Arun. If you, as an entrepreneur or as an individual, decide that I am going to sit and absorb all these resources of money and food and greed and sex and all the good stuff, and I'm going to have it all, right? Okay? That type of rather sociopathic individual is unusual in the real world. But think about something as basic as traffic. We thought we had traffic in Dublin. I've been here for a few days. We don't have traffic in Dublin. Right? But think about the big fancy 4x4 car that you now see emerging on the highways in Jaipur. And the geezer, and it's usually a bloke, slightly rotund gentleman in his middle-aged, and the car is clearly replacing some other inadequacies he feels he has. And he's in his big, big white SUV. And he's stuck behind me in the tuk-tuk. Okay? He's not going any quicker than me in the tuk-tuk. What is good for the individual, i.e. himself, buying his big 4x4, is not good for the collective because it clogs up the roads yet further. And all we end up doing is going slower in bigger cars. Okay? So take that idea for everything we do, that when the individual puts himself first, particularly in a world where things are rationed, i.e. like the size of the motorway, what you get is collective gridlock. Well, I'm not talking about gridlock in the cars, I'm talking about gridlock in our brains. And that's why Arun's discussion and touching on philosophy is so much more interesting. And Tarun as well, I'm sure that in the big American universities, that it's very clear now that economics needs to break out of its own straitjacket and not be threatened by other ideas. Like you were talking about philosophy, I was brought up in a Catholic country, and Catholic dogma is explicitly anti-free market. It comes from Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, because the Catholic dogma, whether you like it or not, believes in the community. But I think we can have both. A little bit less Catholicism, thankfully, and a little bit more of the individual. And it is all possible.
Okay. We have 15 minutes to the clock left. I think it's a good time to open up this session to get some questions in. Please raise your hand. Let the microphone come to you. The young lady there, she raised her hand first. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for that. That was an exciting panel. You spoke of self-expression, right? And I think that's an interesting concept because even Marx speaks of creative labor and the species essence. And I think that is very intrinsic and fundamental to the human. But I'd like to know, where does one perhaps draw the line between self-expression and self-interest, as we dealt with the topic earlier? I think it's very easy to blur that line, but I want to know where you stand in terms of where does that exist? Because I think the thirst for profit is sort of inevitable, right?
Are you asking this of David or the entire panel?
David.
I think the profit is only the referee in this game. That's the way I look at it. It's kind of a scorecard at the end. What I've always found interesting is why people decide to do something for themselves, whether it's a piece of art or this idea of what I would call commercial self-expression. What I have noticed in my own country, but I believe this has been replicated in almost every European country since the Dutch Republic, is that when the society becomes more tolerant and more liberal, and more tolerant of outsiders, and more tolerant of people whose lifestyles isn't your own, or whose religion isn't your own, or whose colour of skin isn't your own, what you see is a very interesting coincidence, like a co-evolution of philosophical or democratic or social liberty and tolerance, and a massive upsurge in commercial creativity, and also other types of creativity. So the country I was born in the 1960s was a theocratic state where the individual was entirely subsumed to a sort of a clerisy, a Catholic clerisy. And one of the major pillars of the clerisy was don't get above your station, okay? And certainly don't try to express yourself commercially or artistically or sexually or anything, okay? As that dead hand of dogma began to recede and the people began to say, you know what? I don't want to go to Mass. We kept going to confession, which is a good one, though. Confession is the best sacrament, Eddie, ever, because you can do bad stuff and be forgiven, and you can do it again the next day. But what you saw was this flowering of self-expression. And then the question is, if you get that dynamic, to your point, if you get that exciting dynamic, is the society then, are the bonds that gel the society then sufficiently glued together and adhesive to say to those who get the resources through their own labours, okay, cool, but you're going to have to pay very high rates of marginal taxation, which we do. If you can get to that stage, and those monies are used wisely to create the conditions for the next generation coming up, the kids whose parents didn't have education, the kids whose grandparents worked usually on the roads in England, actually. Most Irish people worked in England at a certain stage, and now they're all coming back because of Brexit, which is kind of funny, but we're not going to give them passports. No, we are. But the point is, the energy and the money that is generated from self-expression, if used widely, can, I believe, create a much better state and a much better community.
Okay, great. Next one. Gentleman there. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Sorry. I'd like to ask about antitrust. And the reason I ask about antitrust is it's sort of a forgotten word. It's been a forgotten word since roughly the 1970s. But if you go back 100 years, the debate between the power of the entrepreneur, between the power of the vote, between money power versus people power, was a very public debate, especially in the United States. And so while you're celebrating the entrepreneur, which I think everyone agrees we should, we have this weird dilemma because right now, and I'm going to use the example of the United States, entrepreneurship in the US is at its lowest level in 40 years. Why? Could you imagine opening a bank in the US right now? There are 4. Telecom company, 3 or 4. Everything has reached a level of aggregation, a level of bigness, that the entrepreneur is actually effectively blocked from entering spaces. When I moved, I've lived in India more or less since 2007. When I moved here, there were 15 telecom companies. We have 3 this week and probably 2 in a few months. So there has to be a discussion if we want to talk about entrepreneurship as a social good, and we want to talk about balancing, as Mr. Maira talked about, money power and people power.
Okay.
What about antitrust?
So this is a very good point. It brings the old debate that we've been debating for a long time, scale versus entrepreneurial energies versus competition, so to speak. Maybe both of you could take it.
Yeah, the word trust, you got me. You're right. I mentioned that the world, many people in the world are losing faith in the model that currently is operating in the world. Lack of trust in that model. Mahatma Gandhi did say that he had no problem with capitalism. He said, and he was from Gujarat, you must be a business person because then you will use resources efficiently to produce some surplus out of it. But the surplus that is produced is not yours. That belongs to society. And he wasn't suggesting that the corporations or the enterprises be owned by the Marx-like state, because there also he said the freedom of the individual is completely curbed. So the people must be the owners of the capital. They must be the owners of the capital. That was his model of capitalism, which was entrepreneurial. He wanted India to be, he probably envisaged 300 or 400 million people, 400 million Democrats and 250 million capitalists. Not a few capitalists. That's what he envisaged. And his model of the spinning wheel, as he said, was this. People must produce, do something productive to produce something useful for the community and earn something thereby. And if everybody was to be producing something useful, which is useful to the community, we'll get what Adam Smith said, butcher the baker and the candlestick maker. But as Adam Smith also said, don't trust any business people when they come together quietly. They're up to some mischief. They're trying to, that's what he said, remember? They're trying to make out how the rules should be changed to suit themselves. Don't do that. So the trusteeship is a way of living, as it were. That, I will be efficient, I'll be a damn good manager and entrepreneur, but what I produce is not mine to pass on to my children who may not be entrepreneurs, or even to spend in big things in my own life. We have mistaken this. Now I ask my friends around to say, well, can we tell me some organizations which are embodying that principle of trusteeship? Says, yes, Tata's my old group. They've got a trust, you see. That's not it. Creating a philanthropy in which you make money by all sorts of ways of curbing competition, raising prices, denying people fair wages, damaging the environment, and you make profit. And then you spend that profit in a trust for the sake of the people. It is 7 days a week you're causing harm, and then you go to the church for 10 minutes on the last day and say, I've given this offering, I'm absolved of all my sins. So it's an orientation, and we've got to reconstruct enterprises, and this is my thing. We've got to reconstruct enterprises in which more people are the owners than just the few who are employing others and selling to others. A new model, and Gandhiji was proposing this and written it very well. He was an economist for our times. You've got to reconstruct the business corporation, he said. It must be business, not just for the people in this charity or philanthropy or selling them stuff, but businesses by the people and of the people. They own the businesses. We need this model.
Okay. So just to go back to the question about antitrust, and you use the U.S. example. So I think there's a real lesson there. The lesson is that I don't think in the U.S. that we lost sight of the idea that we should curtail excessive power. That idea was always there. The problem, I think, was it was operationalized in a very narrow way. It was operationalized in the simple principle that as long as prices to end users don't rise, there's no damage, right? Now, the rise of the internet economy and the platforms has demonstrated that you can damage people even if prices are not rising.
Or even if the product is free,
even if the product is free. So in the limiting case, the product is free, but you're still causing extensive damage, negative externalities all over. So the principle is still there, but our operationalization of the principle didn't keep pace with it. And I think there's a real lesson there, that you shouldn't lose sight of the elementary logic before you do anything
Just
else.
vote for Bernie. I'm serious. Just vote for Bernie, because he will introduce
Well, the mic is
antitrust
closest
legislation.
to you, so go ahead, sir, quick. Yes, and then a lady. We're just going to keep gender balance in the questions, please. Yes. The young lady there. Go ahead.
A question either for Arun or Tarun. India's got a fine tradition of social responsibility of business, and yet on metrics of ES and G, Indian business fares very badly. Tarun, one of your colleagues, George Serafim, has proved that ESG is good in the self-interest of a company. You make more money, your valuation goes up. Why is this? Why, particularly on G, governance, and most especially environment, E, is Indian corporations failing us?
Okay. We'll take two questions so that we can... Yes, the young lady there. Go ahead, ma'am.
Hi. So you had mentioned that poverty obliterates the future. So what measures do you think that we as individuals can take to actually, help stabilize this for people who are below the food chain? How do you think we can help?
Okay. We have 4 minutes on the clock. All three of you can answer these questions, and then we'll probably have to close. Go ahead.
Scorecards. That lady asked the question earlier about maybe even your personal scorecard. What are you producing in your life, and how would you measure what you are doing? For business also. If it's not to be purely selfish, it must be measuring what it's producing not just for its shareholders, but with respect to outcomes for the community. To introduce balanced scorecards, now there's history in India. Many organizations, and yours, you were at Tata's at the time, voluntarily got together, along with the GRI, Global Compact, and others who got scorecards and say, what's the right scorecard for businesses in India? They developed the National Voluntary Guidelines, took the government, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, blessing, and asked the Ministry of Corporate Affairs to bless it and say, this is a useful scorecard which all businesses in India should voluntarily adopt. And the stock exchange agreed to ask the top 100 to mandatory do so. What happened? A business lobby went and said, bad idea, too much work for us. If you just allow us to pay 2% of our profits into CSR, the government loves this, politicians loved it, and so this idea of the National Voluntary Guideline which was developed went off. This goes on and on. Even now, as you know, the Business Roundtable in the United States met together and they said, the 120, that it should be stakeholder responsibility and accounting. The Economist comes out and says it's a balmy idea. Business or business should be only business. So you can see an idea which is vested in itself because it gets power. And many people support that idea in business because it gives them power. This is what we have to overcome.
Just a brief response to the ESG. I think even in the sort of so-called Western economies, George's analysis notwithstanding, there's a lot of controversy about whether voluntary adoption of, shall we say, pro-social norms is resulting in short-term benefit to the adopter in some sense. There's a lot of statistical and other controversy about it. But leave that aside. I think, just thinking about practical experiences in India and other developing countries, there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. I mean, there's so many different ways that people can get away with self-dealing and privately siphoning off stuff still in most places that I think at the individual level, if you're an unethical business person, it simply doesn't pay. That's my belief, unfortunately. So that's something that we have to tighten the noose around in some sense and make an example of some people, basically.
On the final comments.
Yeah, just to the lady's question on obliterating the future, if you look at countries that have managed to move out of poverty permanently, whether they are certain countries in Latin America during the 1920s, 30s, or certain European countries, what you see everywhere are really significant efforts in free education, not just in terms of access, but in terms of quality of that education. It seems that unless you institute a very explicit form of free education, which is standardized and fair. Because it's very easy to have unfair education for wealthy people. This seems to be what is common to all countries that have moved from low income to middle income and subsequently to higher incomes. It strikes me that around the world, unless this is done in an age of the smartphone where very poor people can see what middle class people have elsewhere and conceive in their own countries and can become angry at their lack of education and opportunity and this idea that they cannot have a future because everything's in the present, I think we will be dealing in 10 or 15 years with the question of how does this democracy thing die? So the stakes are very, very high.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. To go back to the organization that was quoted right in the beginning, we seem to have solved all problems neatly. Klaus Schwab would be proud. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being a wonderful audience. Thanks to my great panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. What an amazing session to start with. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Tarun Khanna, Arun Maira, David McWilliams, and Hindol Sengupta. The session was presented by Business Standard. Please remember to take anything you brought into the venue with you when you leave. Thank you.
Now it's going grey, it's even worse. Great stuff. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
What inspires you?
Purity in creation.
Is done.